Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Humblefish and Friends, and I'm your host, Humblefish, and this is my guest, Vince Loves Fish. How you doing, Vince?
Good, nice to be here. Got to rep the shirt, of course.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. That's awesome. So you're one of our fish disease experts on the forum. So you help out on the forum answering questions, people that have fish disease questions. You also work at a local fish store, but let's just start off. I just would like you to introduce yourself and whatever you'd like to share with the audience. Just tell us all about yourself.
Yeah, so I haven't been reefing as long as some people certainly have, but I think that gives an interesting dynamic for what we're going to be talking about later today, where we're talking about burnout and reefing. I went really hard. I was a freshwater hobbyist for a long time. I grew up in the industry. My dad owned a pet store for a long time, so I went to trade shows and I had my little aquariums here and there. And then I was always told, "Oh, don't do saltwater; it's too hard." So finally I think I went to an Aquashella a few years ago and just got inspired with how cool the coral was and seeing all the stuff. So I got into that, found my way to Humblefish eventually because I had to know everything. So I had to know everything about disease. Because I was like, I'm going to invest all this money in this tank. May as well do it right. So that's how I find my way there. And here I am.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So what else, like, tell us something else about yourself. What else do you do outside of the aquarium hobby? Like, what are your other interests?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Mostly aquariums, huh? I think the most other interesting fact about me, I used to be a Zamboni driver for a while. So for probably like 6 years, I drove a Zamboni at ice rink, tournaments, all that kind of stuff, and it was kind of a really fun profession that I stepped away from. I was to do the aquarium industry. I really wanted to work at a fish store and explore that. The other thing about me, I actually have a psychology degree, so I am a little fish psychologist, I like to say. So that was a really fun thing. I finished that degree and I maybe come back to that one day and do like a master's degree. Maybe not. We'll see how it goes.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. So let's talk on. We got a couple of talking points here. First is that you work in a local fish store. So why don't you tell us about that? Tell us about, I guess maybe I get, a lot of people probably wonder they what it's like to actually work in a local fish store day to day. Maybe you could just tell us about your day. Like, what is your day
Sure.
typically like working at the fish store?
It's a lot of cleaning. I'll tell you that. Um, Probably like 70% of my time is cleaning, just working on something. There's always something to fix on. You got like 50 plus tanks. I mean, you got 50 plus different kinds of hardware. You have skimmers on everything. You've got pumps to clean. You got drainage to make sure everything's clean. You got just the glass to do. I also do a quarantine program. So, like, I have a lot of stuff going on there as well, making sure that's all good. And then it's obviously talking to a lot of customers day to day, helping beginners out, talking to advanced hobbyists, talking to everybody at different levels. So you have to be able to come down depending on whoever you're talking to. And this person could be doing something super niche and they're trying to get advice on this. And then you go to somebody who's just trying to keep a goldfish. So being
Right.
dynamic is a very important part of that for sure.
Okay. And your store sells both freshwater and saltwater, correct?
Yep. Yep.
So you have to be knowledgeable about both. Obviously, you are because I can see those beautiful angels and discus behind you
Mm.
there. So
Yeah. So you kind of have to play a fish psychologist a lot of times. And there's credit to saltwater too. I think that's even harder. You have to understand, like, okay, what is the niche of this fish? What is it going to interact with? What kind of interactions it's going to have? Is it going to be negative? Is it going to be great? Like, is it going to work out? Is it questionable? A lot of times it's a maybe. I don't know if that is really going to work out the way that you're trying to do it. Here's what I recommend doing. Oh, you want to put in a powder blue tang in the start? Well, here's what I would say about that. But you do you. It's your own tank.
right.
But making sure people aren't mixing giant cichlids in with little tetras. There's a lot of that going around, so you have to be knowledgeable of that. We also do plants, so I do a lot of planted tanks. I carry a lot of plants there. I have planted displays there to talk about. We do coral as well, so I have customers that have want to do fish only. It's a surprising amount that I was surprised that there's a lot of people who just want to keep fish for saltwater.
Right.
Um, and they're too scared of coral. So, then I'm talking with the people who, all right, I'm ready for coral. What do I do? Okay, you're going to get this little zoanthid and you're going to put it on your rock. It's going to do okay. I promise. That kind of stuff there.
And you know what I find interesting? It's actually, corals actually seem to be easier to keep than fish because you don't have
Yeah.
to worry about the disease issues as much.
Yeah, it's certainly true. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I carry is like softies, LPS. I'm not like an acro store or nothing like that. I have some SPS, but nothing crazy. And it's really, I think a lot of people, if they just do a water change, it's pretty easy to maintain a basic reef tank,
Okay.
even a smaller one. My girlfriend's tank, she's got like one of those Fluval 13 and a half gallons. I've got softy corals, hammers. I just do water change every week, pretty basic. So it's kind of being able to talk them through that process and like, it's okay, just do this, it'll be okay. Like the fish is obviously the harder thing. I mean, with quarantine, how we do it, right? It's part of our job to also educate on why is quarantine important, right? Because you're going to be buying either captive bred stuff or buying quarantine stuff. And why is that important versus going to somewhere else that they're not treated, they're just kind of plopped in the tanks? Like how to distinguish that, educating them on how to pick fish. A lot of people don't talk about that sometimes, where it's like, okay, make sure that fish is eating. Or I love to tell people like, oh, this fish has been here for 3 months. He's eating really
Right.
good. This is what he's eating. Let me show you how he's eating. He's doing really good, right? So that it has that relationship with that customer to show them, hey, this is a good quality fish, right? I'm not just
Right.
talking out of my butt.
And that's, to me, that's one of the big advantages of actually, everybody likes to do online ordering nowadays, but to me, a big advantage of actually, buying and supporting a local fish shop, you get to go inside, you get to pick out the fish you want, you get to ask, I'd like to see this fish eat. You put food in the water, and then not only do you know that the fish is eating when you buy it, you actually get to leave with the food that you saw it eat. So you're already, because that's one of the big challenges. People will get in fish, that they order online. Whether you put it in your DT or into a quarantine tank, the fish won't eat. In a local fish store, you know that the fish is eating before it ever leaves the store. So to me, that's huge. That gives you a huge advantage.
The other thing too is they've been in quarantine for like 30 days or whatever. So in addition to the time that it's been out here, it's already gone through that process of getting more comfortable and conditioned to an aquarium, right? So that helps there as well. And I have customers that literally they'll keep an eye on a certain fish for a week.
Mhm.
And like, oh, I've been keeping an eye on it. It's doing really well. I'm like, yep, it sure is. I feed them every day.
That's
You know,
awesome. That's
and
awesome.
they finally come and get it, or coral too. Like I've had the same thing with coral. Like they've been watching something. I'm like, oh, I have that one in the back because it's not doing well. They'll wait 3 months until it recovers, and they're like, oh, it's finally great. I'll take that.
What I love about that? You're actually sounds like you're forming relationships with your customers, and they get to know you and your methodologies and what you're doing, and you get to probably, like, you probably remember some of them. You remember their
Mhm.
tanks and everything, and you have that that customer store relationship. That used to be, that was in the old days is how we did it. So I really like that. That's really cool.
I have a lot of regulars that just come in every week just to talk with me and see what's going on and see how's things doing. I've helped, like, I've one of my friends now, they were a couple that came in and they had gotten 10 glowfish for like a 9-gallon tank. And they came in the next day after they had all passed and they were like, why did this happen? And I held their hand all the way to the point where now they have two reef tanks right now, like a 90-gallon that's full of coral, and they have a 40-gallon anemone tank. And I help them out with stuff still here and there, but they've kind of gone off their own a little bit. And it's like you're proud to see them succeed, and that's really what it's about.
Right.
And I'm not afraid to say, hey, you know what? You should go hit up the local clubs and see if you can get like these cool anemones because I can or something. Like
Right.
I'm not afraid to recommend, not just myself. So.
Well, and you're proud, and you're making your store proud because you're actually providing good customer service. You're able, you're actually taking an interest in them. You want to see them succeed. So then, that's a very good, just it adds to the reputation of the store that you work for. And then, word kind of spreads, hey, this is a good place to go to buy fish, buy corals, whatever. And I mean, I love that, man, because that's how it used to be in the old days, and there's so much. I'm not against online buying, but there's so much online buying nowadays that it kind of seems like sometimes local fish stores are falling by the wayside, and I hate to see that happen.
Yeah, I always loved going to the fish store and shooting the shit with somebody. It was really nice to have that dialogue, or like it makes my day when somebody really asks me good questions.
Right.
Like I never thought I'd enjoy that, where you get like a question that makes you think like, oh, what have I done? Or no, I haven't done that before. Let me research that and I'll get back to you. Or like, tell me what you find. I never kept that fish before. Tell me about it. Like I love learning from people too, just as much as I love learning for the hobby. It just helps everybody at the end of the day.
Right. Exactly. So what would you say is your favorite part about working at a local fish store?
Keeping the fish that I can't keep at home. I think that's probably the best. Being able to see and get in these different cool fish, or oh yeah, I'd never have one of these fish before, but I love to work with them and see what I'd like. So I get a lot choosy, as far as like, okay, well, if I ever do this, I'm going to get this because I really had a good experience with this kind of fish, or I really like the way that looked. Or sometimes when I order something and I don't know what it'll be, sometimes like as far as I've never seen this in person before. Like I remember I got a bluehead tilefish,
Oh yeah.
and that thing was like 6 inches. It was huge, and I was like, I was expecting something, 2 inches or something, and it was just beautiful. So it's kind of surprises there. Sometimes fish get mixed up. I get random fish sometimes here and there, and so that's like, oh, what's this fish? Oh, great, I don't want that actually. Okay, let me put that on sale. Cichlids, of course, are really cool. Discus, I love my discus. So
Mhm.
like I get to really kind of work with distributors, wholesalers, and be like, hey, you got this really cool thing in? Oh yeah, I got it. So I this is how these guys came in here. I got these from a place out of Florida. And they came in really beautifully, and I was really excited about them. And I said, I really want these for my tank at home one day. And then I set it up and I finally got them. So I watched them in the store for probably like 3 months, until I finally got them for myself.
So you get to, like you were saying, you get to deal with fish that you're probably never going to keep in your home aquarium, but you're like, I get to at least work with the fish and learn about the fish, at the fish store. And then the more
Mm-hmm.
experiences you have with those fish, you can also pass that information off to your customers as well.
Mm-hmm.
So okay.
Yeah, if
Conversely,
something's interesting,
no, go ahead.
yeah, if something's like interesting, and I've never heard of it before. I mean, that's the perfect opportunity to learn from that. Like, or they send me a picture and like, hey, look at this cool fish. And I'm like, I've never seen that before. Like, let me learn about that, and then maybe I'll get it.
Right. So conversely, what would be the worst part, the worst thing about working in a local fish store?
Oh,
Put you on the
let's
spot.
see
I'm
here.
sorry.
Um, no, that's a good question. Um, I can't. I feel like I can't say cleaning because it's a given. Sometimes I actually get quite joy out of really meticulously cleaning this one spot of algae so it's all perfect looking. Probably when emergencies. We had a power outage or this early this year. We had a huge snowstorm. Our power was out for maybe 18 hours, I think.
Okay.
Um, so we got a generator, and I was really concerned about tanks everywhere. We were run off of one of those blower style air uh, pumps, and so we were able to hook that to a generator, and it powered most of all our stuff for us because of freshwaters and sponge filters. So disasters are probably one of the worst parts about that, if that does happen. As far
Right.
as like day to day goes, um, when somebody is unwilling to listen to you when they're making a big mistake, I
Right.
think that's probably the worst part of it. You know, or they, this saltwater, not as often. I would say freshwater, this is pretty typical. I mean, somebody's going to want to put like 6 goldfish in a 10-gallon tank, and you're trying to explain why that's a bad idea, and so I'm say no to them, and they get really upset on that. Or like saltwater, where it's like, oh, why are you getting this fish? Like, you should not. I don't want, like, you're a paying customer, so I can't like say no to you necessarily, but I'm going to tell you every reason why you should not do this. right? And you're kind of doing yourself a disservice at that point. So
No, that's good. That's good stuff, because I think a lot of people either, like, want to work in a fish store. Everybody ultimately, it seems like, a lot of, you'll see people say their dream job is to own a local fish store someday, but they don't realize the pros, the cons, the hard work that goes into it, all the manual labor that goes into it. It seems kind of glamorous in a way, but then the nuts and bolts of it can be a completely different, a whole different thing. So that's good.
it's
Yeah.
a really doing job.
Yep.
Like that's what I say is a doing job. Like you have to have the energy to always be doing something. Like I'm always cleaning something. I'm always working on something that needs to get done. Or like, oh, I make to-do lists every single day, to get X amount done. I'm very organized. I try to be. I have lists, like 2 different lists for stuff to do. So you have to be on top of that, or else stuff starts going by the wayside or whatnot. So that's pretty hard work there, I'd say. And it's hard, especially coming home from that. You have all these fish tanks at home. I mean, most of us, when I went into starting working there, I had probably 15 fish tanks. And it quickly got a little too insane. I had the whole fish room. I've had racks of fish tanks and fish tanks in every single room. And now suddenly, you would had a whole day and change probably like 300 gallons of water. Okay, you need to change your water at home too.
Right.
So going from working in that environment to then trying to enjoy your tanks at home is probably an also very difficult thing to do as well.
Right. It's like, I guess, kind of like being a carpenter, and then you come home and you've got all these home projects you need to work on, but you really don't want to work on them because you spend all day doing carpentry work for other people. It's probably something like that.
And then it's harder because we're working with living animals. So then the guilt is a lot higher, if you don't get something done at home, if you're a carpenter or whatever. But
Right.
if you neglect your tanks, your livestock suffers from that.
Yes.
You lose fish. Your corals start to die. I had that a lot. I didn't test my water for probably like 2 months, when it was really bad. And you're like, oh, whatever, I guess that passed away or whatever. Okay, well, maybe I'll do a water change tomorrow. It just falls behind, and then you got to do it for all the other tanks too. So
Right.
that gets pretty hard there.
So, kind of like keeping with that a little bit, what mistakes, because you probably deal with a lot of beginners working in a local fish store. What mistakes do you see that beginners make when they first enter the hobby? What are the most common ones that can be, maybe somebody listening to this that is a beginner or is thinking about entering the hobby, that they can maybe avoid making, in your experience?
Impulse buying. We are all victims of impulse buying, and the worst impulse is the wrong one, right? Where you buy something you shouldn't have and it disrupts your tank, or maybe you can't afford that and you put it on a credit card or something. You're like, well, I just have to have this. Like we have this collector-itis, I think, sometimes,
Right.
where we just got to have the stuff. Some people it doesn't hit them as hard, or some people really want to buy all the equipment. I think that's a major thing. Getting into the saltwater hobby, I'm very frank with people. I'm like, it's not cheap. You can make it cheap for yourself, and you can make it very expensive for yourself, and it depends on how you do it. And so I totally explain to them, like, with my old tank, this is how this much I paid for this, and then these are the invisible costs I didn't think about. Impulse buying to starting up something that you should have really done more research into as well. That's pretty typical for most, I would say, a lot of freshwater, where you're like, okay, I just have all this fish, or like they come to me. Usually, I have people come to me and say, well, I just lost all my fish. Why is this? It's because they just went to, say, Petco or some other store, and they just like hooked them up and just got like a bunch of fish and shoved it in there, and then they were surprised that they all lost it, and they're just trying to figure it out. And so you have to be patient with them and teach them how to properly keep an aquarium. I mean, we're keeping little tiny ecosystems, right? And that's not easy necessarily. Like we all have done it for a long time, and so for us it's trivial. But for somebody who has no concept of the nitrogen cycle and no concept of bacteria, or what ammonia is and how that affects a fish, it's all new to them. So properly understanding all those concepts is actually relatively difficult.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a lot to, we take it for granted, but there's a lot of little minor details that kind of go into it. And, like just testing, so probably like, for example, if you have somebody who has a fish only, well, then you're primarily focused on testing for things like ammonia and pH. But then, when they upgrade to a reef, it's like, well, now you have to start testing for, more testing for nitrates and phosphates and calcium and alkalinity and magnesium and all that. But yeah, going back to what you're saying, yeah, I think impulse buying is a big problem, and people don't take the time to research before buying. They see something, they want it, they buy it, and then they find out after it's already in their aquarium, well, maybe this wasn't really the best, it doesn't really mesh with my other fish, or maybe it eats corals or something like that, which, sometimes a 5-minute Google search will answer those questions for you. So let me ask you this. What happens when,
What?
somebody's gonna like you can tell they're gonna make a mistake. A beginner comes in and like they're asking you for advice. You give them advice, but you can kind of see that they're gonna make a mistake. How do you deal with that when you know that they're gonna make a mistake? Do you just go with it or what?
No, the first step is really, it's hard to immediately say no to somebody. We all kind of don't want to be told no. And the first part of it is education, right? Teaching why it's not a good idea to do that. Like, okay, a classic example I'll give you: Mandarin dragonets. A lot of people love the way they look. It's one of my favorite fish, but most people's tanks aren't set up for that. They don't understand what actually goes involved into keeping this thing alive and healthy. And I think that's a really clear distinction. Keeping a fish is one thing, keeping it healthy and thriving is another thing too.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of fish that can survive pretty bad situations. So with that, you first do the education, you explain why it's a bad reason. 99% of the time it works, right? That person is going to understand that. They're going to listen to you. They're going to hear you out. The other 0.1% is going to say, well, I want it anyways.
Right.
And that's difficult in terms of, I think, any fish store. At the heart of it, we want to make money. It's a business, right? This person is still going to spend money, but they're going to endanger this animal. And that what makes the store stand out, in which they will tell you no at the end. No, I don't think you should have this at all. I'm just not going to sell it to you. Like, that thing's going to die, right?
Wow.
And that's what matters with who cares about the pets.
Right. So you actually like refuse to sell livestock to
Yeah.
something that you thought,
Yeah.
that's kudos on you. I like that. Cause I mean, most local fish stores will be like, well, at the end of the day, the customer's always right. So I just sell them whatever,
No, it's part of your reputation is on the line too, because what if that person then goes around and says, well, they let me do this, or like something like that. I don't, it's something, but it's also a moralistic kind of responsibility for being the caretaker for these pets. Like, they're pets. I think a lot of people tend to think, maybe not say saltwater, but definitely like freshwater, where, oh, these are just fish, right? So what does it matter if they die? Oh, well, it's just a goldfish. I believe wholeheartedly that you should put in the proper care for each pet that you get. Like, if you cannot provide the proper housing, the environment, the nutritional needs, any of that, then it's not for you, right? You shouldn't do it.
Right.
Get something easier.
That's a good attitude to have. So let's just summarize here. So summarize what advice somebody watching this that is thinking of entering the hobby and they want to avoid pitfalls, what advice would you give them, just briefly, on mistakes that they should avoid? What should they do and what mistakes should they avoid before entering the hobby?
The first is research everything, right? To a point. There is, of course, so much information online. I think that was one of my biggest complaints when I entered the saltwater side of the hobby, that there is so much information to go through, and everybody has this way of doing it. Everybody has this way of doing it, and which one's the right, and they're all fighting for which one's the best, when really the simple one is the best for a beginner. Once you get that kind of foundational knowledge, that's the important part. So for fish keeping in general, I mean, the nitrogen cycle, researching the fish that you're going to get information from, you can get information from the person working at the local fish store, but I also suggest, doing a quick Google search. I mean, I would go into a fish store, look at the name of it, Google it, and see as much information as I can about it within like 2 minutes. I mean, there's so much information you have access to. Then ask opinion. Sometimes, there's some fish that have certain information online and it may not be the reality that most other people experience. Like there could be lists that say, oh, you can totally mix a red-tailed shark with like all these other fish or in a small tank. And you're going to ask that person, a local fish store, to go, no, it's a horrible idea. Let me tell you why. It's the same thing with looking at sometimes tank size suggestions, like for tangs or something, and then you finally realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't put this in such a small tank, but the internet says, well, minimum, like it shouldn't be about minimum all the time. It should be about recommended.
Right.
So yeah, having that is probably very important entering the hobby, like having that, being out, it's hard to, it's a skill, being able to discern the information that you're being given is truthful and accurate, right? And who do you trust? I say get information from multiple sources to confirm, right? Ask the person at the store, Google it, maybe ask a buddy, and use that to kind of formulate an opinion that is, for the most part, probably accurate. So do your research on stuff, get second opinions on things. Don't go too fast. So going too fast is, I think, a big mistake. Start small, start reasonable, right? For you, for your family, for your spouses, for your budget, right? Start reasonable. Kind of get that expectation. Maybe ask around, ask the store, like, oh, well, how much would this be? I go around with people and I go, okay, well, you need this, you need this, you would need this, you would need this. Like, these are all the key components for starting an aquarium. So you get that idea of what it's going to be. Have a realistic expectation of what the care is going to be for those animals. Like how often are you going to do water changes? How much of these should you have? Those sort of things.
No, that's excellent advice. That's excellent. And I like what you said, starting small, because you know how it goes. Once you start out in this hobby, you start, one tank becomes 2, becomes 3, becomes 4. So that smaller tank that let's say you start out with a 20 or 30 gallon tank, you're not throwing your money away, because that tank, once you upgrade to something larger, can be repurposed as a quarantine tank or a frag tank or whatever, so yeah, that's a really good, start small. I mean, I know people in this hobby like to say, go big or go home, but I think sometimes people get into these really huge tanks without knowing what they're doing, and then they overextend their budget, and the next thing they know, they've got fish dying, and it's a 180 gallon, 200 something gallon tank, and the spouse is like, what are you doing? You're bankrupting us here. So that's good advice. I also really like to recommend, if you live in an area that has a local club, join a local club, find a mentor. You've heard it said, it's really true. Find someone that you like the way their tank looks, and let them guide you. Let them be your mentor, because obviously if they have an aquarium that you feel is successful, then they've proved they know what they're doing, a lot of times based on that. So yeah, that's all great information.
That's how I got into it. I mean, I had a mentor. He was actually my boss at the ice rink, and he had a 180 gallon Reef. It's beautiful, SPS dominant tank, and it's plumbed through the wall. And I was like, all right, like I want to get, like, this tank I got in a good deal is like $200. I drove like 2.5, 3 hours, I think, for it. And I didn't even know if it was going to fit, but I made it work. And tank stand, a bunch of other stuff. And I didn't know what I was getting into. A perfect example, like I didn't know how much it was going to cost to actually start this. Most of all that stuff I still have and use regularly, but the upstart, I think I paid maybe like $3,000, and that was quite the shock for me. Yeah. I didn't understand that. And then you have to stock that.
Right.
And that was a horrible part. you're like, you put all this money in it, now you got to put stuff in it.
Right.
It's got to look pretty. I have that problem where it's like I got multiple tanks. Now you got to split up the budget for all these tanks. There's always something that you want to do differently too. In here I want more plants, I want some more rocks, but I'm just kind of letting it chill. I think patience is also the most important thing for any hobbyist starting. You have to just let things be. I have some pictures actually we'll show too of like I have a planet tank that eventually grew out to be a beautiful thing, but it started from little tiny pieces. So
Right. So you had patience. You had the patience to grow that out. Not like, I want instant gratification. I want the tank of my dreams. Like right now, you're like, I'm going to start small and someday I'm going to get there where I will have the tank I really want, but I'm going to do it in baby steps.
yeah, I like my frags. I always love the idea of just having big pieces. Like maybe you don't have like 75 different micro frags of everything. Maybe you have 3 giant frags of something, colonies. Maybe you have a giant toadstool leather or something. But you know what? That's still cool.
Yeah.
You can have, and you can always do whatever you want later on. Maybe do the simple things so you can enjoy it. When you're stressing about every little thing about it, maybe it's just like the time management of it, or maybe it's even the financial part of it. Maybe that's not it. You should be able to go, oh, that coral died, I'm not that sad about it. But if you're spending like $150 per frag and you can't stomach that, maybe that's not for you.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So let's talk about burnout, the slippery slope to hobby burnout. And I figure you're probably a good person to talk to about this because you work all day at a local fish store and then you come home and you have all these aquariums you have to maintain. So you probably sometimes feel burnout, because
Yep.
that's what you're doing all the time. How do you fight that? How do you deal with that? How do you manage it?
So let me start with the journey a little bit of how I got burnt out.
Okay.
And it'll lead perfectly into how do you manage it, because I think you don't learn how to manage it until you go through it. And learn what kind of works for you and the skills necessary. Like I had a lot of people try to educate me and tell me and warn me, like, hey, like you be careful. And I said, no, it'll be okay. So coming into this, like I had, like I said, 15 tanks. I had multiple breeding setups, different stuff set up here. I never really stocked heavily, so a lot of my stuff was very planted and kind of took care of itself, which was helped me a little bit. And then I started working at a fish store, and I think, oh great, I get my discount. I can buy whatever fish I want. I can order this thing, cool thing. Oh, all the saltwater fish that are like $100 and something dollars. Oh, I can get that for pretty cheap now, huh? And that just was the end of it. Then you're just spending money. You're like, oh, I'm really excited, and you go too fast. So,
Right.
I think we could do some screen sharing of like that.
Yeah. Let's see some of your tanks. Share, because you were doing that earlier. Yeah. Share your screen.
Let's see
So
here.
see some of your tanks and everything.
So here we go.
Okay. That's awesome.
So this is my first reef tank, and it's not anything to look at. It's like a 15-gallon tank that I had just used. I think this tank is actually 20 years old, and it was leaking. And you can actually see the glue on the edge there of where I tried to stop it from leaking.
Okay.
Like an aqua clear hang on the back filter, a hang on the back refugium for no reason, just because I thought they were cool. Tinfoil blocking the light out from the refugium, like a night crew light on there. And you know what? I could have done a lot with this. I could have had a really nice reef. I could have just let things drown out and enjoy it the way it is. And that would have been great. However, I upgraded to a 120 gallon, like I was saying earlier, where
Okay.
I found this great deal and I was so excited. I was like, oh, everybody keeps telling me I need to have a big reef tank. Oh, this is a 120, it'll be perfect. And it was the start of the problems, right? So bigger tank, bigger problems, more equipment, more money. So this had like a hang in the back overflow that kept me up at night. It flooded twice, I believe, with a power outage until I figured out because nobody tells you these things.
Right.
I had to drill a siphon break on the return nozzle because that's just a hang over the side return nozzle. So that would help there. I at first had a 10-gallon sump. That's how it flooded 40 gallons on my floor.
Mm.
And my return nozzle was really deep in the tank, so it was just draining right away. And I didn't understand kind of the concepts below. Like I could grow coral. Well, I lied. I couldn't grow coral because I didn't understand why my pH was so important in that time. Actually, only really recently have I really did anything for that. Where I had all these like SPS corals. I really wanted to do SPS, even though I really should have just done softy corals, and I would have had a much better time. Which is another thing where I was like, you can enjoy things in a different way. But I really like the SPS corals. They never grew. My pH was always like 7.7. It was nothing grew. That's all it can be. I had it plumb through the wall. And then you can see here, that's probably like 3 months later and nothing's grown.
Okay.
Like barely anything. And throughout this time, it's like I have all these other tanks I'm managing too, and this is supposed to be the cool thing. And this is another thing too that I like to talk about with new hobbyists as well, where you get a big tank, you have so much space for stuff, but that's sometimes a bad thing. And for me, I couldn't just buy a frag, 5 frags every week or anything like that. I couldn't stock this, and I always felt like it was incomplete and I wasn't doing enough for it and I wasn't spending enough money for it. It just wasn't always happy with it. Whereas if I had, say, like a 15-gallon tank, well, I could probably fill that coral with like 6 frags and let them grow out pretty nicely.
Right.
So part of that was, being just disappointed with where it was. And then this is today. This is actually my 40 breeder.
Okay.
So mind the not clean stuff, because I think that we all have dirty tanks a little bit. And I have a lot of softy corals. I figured out that soft corals were more in line with my schedule for what I wanted to do. I was very busy all the time. I didn't have time to really do water changes as much as I'd like. When I get home from work, I don't really want to do anything. And I actually had all these soft corals in my office tank, and that thing would maybe evaporate 6 inches. None of the corals cared. They all stepped going. I'd maybe top it off every week if I remembered. It just kept going. And I think that was really a testament to, like, there is a place for every person's reefing style and kind of lifestyle as well, where you can make it easier on yourself. Why not?
So it's kind of like if somebody's getting burned out from acros or difficult corals, you can always drop back to easier corals, easier LPS, or even soft corals. Yeah, I don't know why. When I was coming up in the hobby, soft corals were king, and now it's almost like, oh, those are like trash or weed corals or whatever. But they're actually easy to keep corals in most cases, and they're easy, they're enjoyable, and they don't stress you out.
Yeah, and I think your hobby shouldn't be stressful. I mean, it's a hobby for a reason. There certainly are times for stress that's going to happen regardless, I think.
Right.
But for the most part, it should be enjoyable. And really quickly, it was not enjoyable for me. I loathed doing a water change, or I loathed, oh, I lost another coral. I'm just sad now, and I should just give up, or, well, and then it's like, well, let me try to do something interesting or do something different. So that was what I was trying to do, is I kept trying to do different things and new things, but then I would burn me out further.
Right.
Like I bred a lot of fish and I was good at it, but I kept doing this fish and then this fish, and I have all these tanks. And I'm like, well, now I have all these babies I got to take care of, and now I got to feed them all. And I'm buying a 16-ounce flat pack like every week. Like, it's a lot of work, and so I just made more work for myself, which is not what I needed.
Right.
Need less work. And it was just, I was always busy at work and came home and it wasn't good. So I used to have like 3 reef tanks, and now I have maybe 4 tanks total. So I have this guy here. I've got the one that I just showed, the 40 breeder over there. It's on the other side of the room. I have an office tank that has a snowflake eel in it. Just that, and it's really fun and interactive, and I don't have anything else to really worry about in there. It's got some aptasia in it, but I don't care.
Right. So what I'm kind of hearing here is kind of like, manage your expectations, know your limits, don't overextend yourself. I mean, you just have to be realistic with yourself, and you have to know, like, this is what I have time for, and this is what I can reasonably do, and I'm not going to overextend that. I'm not going to set up a dozen tanks or whatever and just let this just get out of control and, like, just take over my life, and I'm just make, I'll be miserable,
Yeah, when it starts to become work,
Right.
you have to take a step back and think about, is this okay for you in this moment? Is it stressing you out? Is this harder on you for this reason? Could you do something to make it easier on yourself? Maybe you take a tank down, or you go, you know what? Because you could still enjoy the hobby in a lot of variety of ways. For me, it was actually going back to freshwater. Freshwater fish are just so much easier. They're not as expensive. Well, maybe not these guys. And the plants are, if a plant dies, it only costs you $3.
Right.
And it's pretty easy to grow plants, not that hard. You don't have to test your water all the time. There's certainly like high-tech planted tanks, which are a lot more work, and that's maybe an aspect of the planted tanks that you want to explore. Maybe it's something different. For me, going back to freshwater was the key. So reducing the amount of salt water that I had to worry about. Okay, I don't have to worry about putting corals in there. I can buy like 6 plants and it fills the tank pretty easily, or they'll grow in like within 6 months just fine, and be happy with that. I mean, I've got right here, I have a lot of Java fern. This is all Java fern here.
Okay.
And they came from these plants up here. I have a lot of babies. You can see them sticking out right here that you just trim, and I put them on wood and they've like quadrupled in size,
Awesome.
So it's pretty easy to propagate, that kind of route. So for me, curing that burnout was just one, making it easy, obviously, managing expectations, putting yourself on a budget, and then maybe doing something completely different. Going
Right.
back. There's some saltwater hobbyists that have actually only just did saltwater, which I was surprised. I felt like it was always start with freshwater, then go to saltwater. But I've met a lot of people that have just jumped.
I'm meeting, more people I know are actually getting out of saltwater and either going to freshwater or going back to freshwater, for like the reasons you talked about. It's just, it's easier to maintain. Also the cost. The cost is it's a lot more affordable, and people are seeing the cost of what fish and corals and everything are costing nowadays, and they're just like, I just can't do that. But I want to stay in the hobby. I want to be in the aquarium hobby in some way, so they just go back to freshwater. So that kind of right there, kind of, caveats to, freshwater fish, planted tanks, and discus keeping. And I mean, you've got a beautiful freshwater tank I can see back there with angels and discus, and looks like maybe you got some tetras and.
Yeah, sure. I can kind of go through what I got in here.
Yeah, let's see that.
So I've got 3 discus in here. So it's kind of weird to say a discus tank because it's actually mostly angelfish.
Okay.
So I'm trying to fix getting more discus in here. Part of if nobody knows about this, anybody watching, discus are more expensive of a fish. One of the primary reasons is because, these guys, they bought them big already, and somebody had to feed that fish until it was that size. So a lot of the cost in these fish in particular is, one, they're a little harder to breed. They're pretty special. They like very soft, acidic water, really clean water. Raising the babies, you actually hear this a lot. Like, you got to do a water change like every day.
Yeah.
Even if it's a small one. That reason is actually to prevent them from being stunted. Discus should be quite round. And if you see a very pointy discus, it's because it was not taken really good care of growing up. So really round discus is really, you can actually, if you count the eyes and stack them on top of each other, the more that is, the better it is. Like, if you can't put another eyeball on top, well, it's kind of too pointy, so these guys can be kind of expensive. You could buy them as juveniles. They're a lot more cheaper, but you do have to do a lot more water changes. So I bought these bigger. They're also hardier when you get them bigger as well. So they're not a juvenile. They're not a baby. They can handle higher levels of nitrates than the juvenile would. More pollution, a little bit more laid back maintenance schedule. For here, I maybe do like a water change a month. I do have to use RO water. I am on a well. I just already have the RO water. That's actually how I got into saltwater, because I said, well, I already got an RO unit because I had to do it for my freshwater tanks. So I have to do that and remineralize it and all that. So it's pretty soft acidic in here. I have a lot of this is the wood back there is Malaysian driftwood. So for freshwater hobbyists, that releases a lot of tannins into the water, which it's tannic acid, so it will lower the pH and soften the water.
So are you using RO or RODI?
RODI, sorry, yeah.
So then how do okay? So that's I've always been curious about that. So using RODI, what do you use? What product or products do you use to remineralize the
Mhm.
water?
So there's a lot of stuff out there. I use the CChem stuff. So they've got different buffers. I mean, most of it, honestly, I think it's like baking soda and some other kind of acid, you know. They just have a little neat little ratio. And so I don't want to do math. So I just scoop, scoop,
Okay,
scoop, mixes up there. They have like a bottle of like remineralized. It's got calcium and magnesium in there. I mean, really easy thing I could do is just take some tap water and pour it in. And it's sometimes I do that.
okay.
Sometimes I pour a little salt water in there, or if I have a little left over in a cup, I'll just throw it in there. I add some buffer into there a little bit.
Well,
Um,
it's good to know because people don't realize like so when you use RODI for salt water, well, you're adding the minerals back in with your salt mix. But then when you're using RODI for freshwater, you can't just use that. You have to do something to add the minerals and everything back into the water that you would normally have.
yeah, because it'll pull all the salts out of the fish.
Right.
Um,
Dehydrate them.
yeah, dehydrate. Same thing like going hypo in salt water.
Okay.
Um, so you do have to have something. Some fish are a lot more adapted to that. Like these discus, my tank at work that I keep them, it's primarily just RO water, and honestly, it's connected to our saltwater top off system. And so
Okay.
there's a little salt water in the top off system when I top their tank off that
Okay.
adds minerals in there, and I do test it and make sure it's all kind of level. Um, and if I need to, I add some more CChem mineral stuff in there and just kind of bump it up. But as long as everything goes great, it keeps pretty good.
Let me hear.
Um,
I got some images while you're talking. Go keep talking. I've got images that you sent me of some of your discus, so I can just kind of show that off while we're talking here. There
mhm.
we go. Okay, so yeah, it's just showing some of the discus, some of the pictures you sent me, and they're just they're beautiful. They're so. How did you say? I know because I used to breed angels and discus a long time ago, and I know one of the big things was at least when I was doing it, you had to keep the pH around 6.0. How do you do that?
There's a lot of ways you can. It really depends on the water that you're starting with. For RODI water, it's pretty easy, as there's way to calculate it to have the right amount of buffers. That's why I say on the CChem bottles, they'll say, "All right, you want this pH, mix this much in this ratio, and then you're good to go."
Okay,
Having a pH test just to make sure, obviously, that's all good to go. You don't want to do a water change, a big one where the pH is wildly different, because it can shock your fish. With regular tap water, it does also depend on the discus that you keep. There are like strains out there like Stenker. He was a German breeder that he bred it in German tap water that was really high pH, like 8.0, really
wow.
high mineral content. And that strain, he developed them to be nice and hardy. So it really depends on sometimes where you get them. These guys, I'm sure, were kind of imported from maybe like Singapore or Hong Kong. There's usually a lot of discus breeders out of there, and they keep it more soft. So it kind of depends on there, but they still will benefit from that pH lowering. I say like a 6.5 is fine. You don't have to go all the way down to 6.0.
Okay,
Sometimes it can be harder on some other fish, but most fish can adapt. I mean, angelfish, for example, they like it soft and acidic. Um, but you can use driftwood, so that has tannic acid that release tannins like tea.
okay,
Almond leaves, Indian almond leaves are good for that too. Casenaria cones, I think that's what they're called. Different kind of organics that will actually decompose in a tank and release those tannins. Like a black water tank is what we typically think about with that. Or the water, like when I put these 3 pieces of driftwood, that water was just brown for like a long time. And I don't really care too much about it. Some people are pretty, particular about the clarity of the water, but for me, it's more natural.
we
Um,
we used to use peat moss, and it would turn
mhm,
the water kind of like a reddish tinge to it.
mhm. Yep, that was another way to do it.
Yeah.
You could also dilute it, your water, for that's what I used to do actually. I would dilute it with distilled water back in the day.
Okay.
So like a 50-50, my well water in that to try to lower it down. I also have a water softener, so it kind of made keeping fish a little tricky. I usually just kept fish that could just thrive in the water that I had.
Okay.
Um, so that's why I like having the RDI water where I can kind of make it wherever I want. So that's a way to do it. There are like acids and stuff, but then you got to be very consistent with the way that you're doing it. Like you'd have to mix up your water in a large bin pre-dose your tank water to lower the alkalinity down and lower the pH down and get that situated. I don't like to do that too much. I more like do the natural way. So like tannins or stuff like that. So those are some ways to lower the pH for the water.
So some people that are watching this that are like, I want a freshwater tank after seeing what you're doing here. So can you just kind of give us a brief rundown of how do you set up a freshwater tank? Like, just maybe like what filtration you're using, what lighting you're using on the tank. I can't tell if that's actually like, I know there's freshwater sand or if that's gravel. So how do you basically like the basics of setting up a freshwater tank?
So I like to say, do you want to do a planet tank or do you want to do just regular fish? Because the substrate can matter with that way. It depends on what you want to do. This is just kind of a fine grain gravel. It's not quite a sand, but not big enough where it's gravel. It's my favorite substrate personally. This way it kind of actually hides detritus and poop a little bit versus sand, where a lot of the sands in freshwater are very fine and your detritus and stuff are going to settle on top of that. And so if you don't maintain that, it's going to be glaringly obvious. In freshwater, we obviously don't have a ton of flow going around to pick that up like we would in saltwater. So I would choose a substrate there. There are planted substrates. So ones that are like a clay-based, like a fluvial stratum or different aqua soils is what we say. Those have a lot of those minerals for plants locked up in it.
Okay.
So there's like two main classes of plants, briefly. There is more of a water column feeder. So they will absorb a lot of the nutrients from the water column, and a root feeder. So for example, these crypts over here, these are a root feeder. They have really large root structures, and I use what's called root tabs. So you don't even have to use a planted substrate. You can always later on decide you want plants and still keep plants just fine.
Okay.
So these are little tablets that will dissolve in the substrate by the roots, so they'll be able to feed off of that.
Oh, okay.
So substrate, obviously the first thing there. Filtration, it really depends on the tank size. I mean, hang in the back filters are pretty common. I don't like the cartridge ones. Cartridge ones are kind of a waste of money in my eyes. You every time you throw out a cartridge, you're also throwing out all your beneficial bacteria. Most of those filters are not designed with biomedia in mind. So there's no place for that beneficial bacteria to really grow and stay. So I like filters that have biomedia in it. I've also hot rodded hang in the back filters and put filter sponge. So sponge is really a nice medium in freshwater tanks to collect detritus and also have bacteria. To that extent, sponge filters are great filtration. I have two back here. One's not actually working right now. I need a bigger pump. And I have one, you can see the bubbles rising here. So that's behind there. So they are a uplift tube if somebody doesn't know how that works. Air going up through the tube is going to draw water through the sponge, and so it'll collect poop and whatnot, and then also be a place for bacteria to grow, high surface area. The ones I use, I get from Aquarium Co-op. It's a really popular freshwater YouTube personality business. They have a lot of great products. I really like them. These are a coarse sponge, so a fine sponge is going to get clogged up quicker. There's also canister filters. This one is run off a canister filter as well. So, if you're not familiar with the canister filter, it's basically almost like a bucket with pumps in it to suck water through and go through different trays of media. That's probably like the upper level as far as filtration style. Very few freshwater tanks I've seen really run sumps, but that is a thing. But a sponge filter and a hand in the back filter, those are great options. I like ones with biomedia, like I said earlier. Then you'll need a light. So for, say, a planet tank, most LED lights that you can find, say, online or in your local shop, can grow plants. There are like different plants, like similar to corals, where you have high light plants, you have low light plants. All of these ones, for example, are all low light plants. So I don't have this one turned up. This is a fluval one. Usually they have like an LED control. You can do different, schedules and all that. I used to have basic T5 lights that you just had a switch on. I still have those in my fish room. But LEDs, I like LEDs a lot better. They're a lot cooler. So getting something like that, really for the fish, they don't need a whole lot of light. One of the biggest beginner mistakes I see is actually people leaving their light on for too long. And they'll come to the store and they're like, my tank is green. How do I fix this? I go, well, when's the last time you did a water change? And how long is your light on for? And is it in a room full of light? Actually, every beginning of summer/spring, there's an influx of people coming in because they have algae blooms or algae growing everywhere, and they don't connect the dots as far as, well, algae's a plant. You know, it's growing because of all the light. So that's kind of funny. You'll need a heater. Of course, you could use stuff like the BRS titanium heaters. There's a lot of brands out there. I say do your research and see what people like to recommend. I'm very partial to Eheim Jaegers. I think you are too.
Yes. Yeah.
I like those a lot. I think they're really tall and big and clunky sometimes. So, but those are fine. That is if you're keeping tropical fish. There are certainly fish that do not need a heater.
Right.
So if you're trying to go even more low tech, I mean, there's some pretty cool fish that are actually like a temperate species that don't need a lot of warm water. These guys, they need a pretty, I think I have a 500 watt heater in there. Your discus and angelfish, they like it hot. Discus, like 82 to 86. I think I have it right now at like 82, 83.
Okay. So they're like kind of what would be considered more like a warm water fish in salt water. Right. Okay. So like 82 to 86. Okay. That's a good tidbit. Yeah.
Yep. So the other thing here is aeration too. Like you want good enough flow in a freshwater tank, just like you would a saltwater tank, but obviously nothing crazy. They're not like, I mean, some fish, like there's some like pretty cool, like hill stream loaches. Those guys come from fast river environments. They like a lot of flow. But in here, the hotter your temperature is, the less oxygen is available in the water. So that's why I like to have some good surface agitation in there. That way, if I don't like to see fish gasping because there's just not enough oxygen in there. So that's something to consider there. Your decor is really up to you. I don't like stuff that fish can get caught in. Some fish will think that it's a hole that they can go into and they can't come out. I like more natural hardscapes, so having driftwood in there is kind of like important, like a critical part. I always have driftwood in my tanks. I think it just helps feel more natural. It also releases the tannins, which I like. A rock of your choice. I think these are called maple wood or maple rocks or something. I like plants in all freshwater tanks. I don't think I'll really have a freshwater tank that doesn't have plants unless they are a fish that will dig them up, like certain cichlids. And plants are pretty easy. Honestly, most plants, if you go to a fish store, somebody's going to be able to help you and you go, hey, I just want easy plants. And I'm going to go, here you go. This is the easiest plant.
So this guy, I've gone to pet shops before, and they seem like sometimes on some of the planted tanks they have like a CO2 bottle, and they're pumping CO2 into the tank for the plants, I'm assuming. So what kind of plants would you need for that? Doesn't that seem a little counterproductive to oxygen for the fish by doing that? How do you
So it is. Yeah, so that is one of the tricky parts. So we call that a high-tech planted tank. So the plants that really thrive in that environment like higher light typically. The CO2, when there's more dissolved CO2 in the water, plants can grow faster. So because they can't, if I am remembering correctly, if I'm saying it, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but the way it is, plants underwater cannot absorb as much CO2 as they would in air because it's harder for them to diffuse the CO2 into their plant stuff. And so they grow slower underwater. Some plants don't care. There are some really easy plants that grow like weeds. There's also red plants. So if you really want some color, there are plants that have different colors, like reds is usually the common thing. Those guys typically are higher light. They need a lot more intensity, and they also need that CO2 as well. So you'll see that CO2 diffuser. The goal of that is to, it won't be a glug glug. It'll be really tiny micro bubbles that try to diffuse in the water a lot more efficiently. Those are typically also run on a solenoid valve on a timer so that it turns off the CO2 at night because photosynthesis is no longer happening. Okay. So they also typically have some sort of pH monitoring. There is obviously all the way up to people run apexes on planted tanks, but there's also lower scale pH monitoring. There's even old school, I don't remember the name of it, but it's like a little glass thing that you put fluid in and it'll turn colors to indicate the pH level in the tank. So monitoring that is important because if your pH is going to drop, right, and it's going to Your fish don't like that if it drops really quick like that.
So it sounds like
So-
a tricky balance between supplying your tank with enough CO2 to fuel plant growth, but then you don't want to have too much CO2 and you know, asphyxiate your fish.
Yeah, so they use like bubble counters and stuff too, just like a CO2 reactor to measure that. Full disclosure, I have not actually run a high-tech planet tank. It is expensive, like for a freshwater tank. I mean, you're at least in like $100. Like for something like this would be crazy. You need a giant, you know, CO2 cylinder and a whole setup for that. You know, you're talking pretty expensive money there.
Are there
But
any
for-
plants that have to have this, or it's just basically so that you can the plants grow faster? Is that the
I
whole
think that some people would disagree and say that absolutely, but I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that plants are pretty adaptable, but there are some plants like, say, hair grass, some of the carpeting plants that they just don't do well, and then maybe they end up dying out. They just won't grow. I've had plants just never grow.
Right.
It's because I picked one that needs that it's recommended to have highlight and CO2. You know, it's a balancing act. Actually, I've had one of the plant tanks I have at work. I have a nice lid on. It's really enclosed, so I've actually keep a lot of natural CO2 in there, and so it helps with that plant growth, even if it's a little bit. So I don't necessarily need a CO2 diffuser, but it's at least trapping and it's not getting as much oxygen, you know, being diffused through the surface agitation. But all my fish are still fine.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're getting ready to wrap this up pretty soon. I do want to ask you one more thing, but while it's 9:02, if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask either myself or Vince, I'm gonna start looking at the chat while you're talking. So please get your questions in, and we will we'll ask Vince questions, whatever questions you have. So I want to know about, you've got those angels and discus. Have you bred them yet, or do you have plans to breed them in the future?
Oh, he's giving you a nice look right there. Look at him.
Oh yeah.
So that one I think is my male. I think
Okay.
I have 2 males and 1 female in here. You do see that they chase each other throughout here. Really, discus are a schooling fish, and I do need more of them. They've gotten along just fine. They do chase each other here and there. So 2 of them I suspect could be a possible pair. I have a secondary tank here that I will probably move them in here pretty shortly and set up with a breeding cone. They like to breed on flat surfaces, discus and angelfish. I actually have some slate somewhere, I believe. But you could use like a PVC tube. There's been some like ceramic, like pottery style breeding cones out there on the market. I'll just see what happens. I mean, it's not the easiest to get them to pair up and then spawn. That's for sure. A really easy way to do that, even with angels, is buying a group of juveniles, growing them up, and then they'll figure it out amongst themselves. I have not really seen too much spawning behavior, but I'm hoping. I'd love to breed some discus. But I will be probably getting a batch of younger discus to raise up and see if they'll pair off in that way.
So kind of like use them to test.
Yeah.
Kind of perfect your skills before you actually. Yeah, I bred angels and discus. It's been a long time ago, but oh man, it was a lot of work. And
angels will breed like guppies.
Yeah. They get very aggressive too. If you put, I used to use slate, and they would get extremely aggressive. They would start killing the smaller tetras and the other fish that would get a little too close to their eggs, because there's like a whole timing thing to taking the slate away from them, to then.
Yep. Or like to collect the eggs. Exactly. Yeah, I've got some pictures actually. Let's see here. Let's see. I have more this way. So this is what I wanted. There's some of the planet tanks I had. This was the office that I had.
Okay.
My valve grew really long. This is where it ended up. It's at work right now. So as you can see, it's very bare. And eventually it's really full now. All that valve grew and all that crypts just took off. Then here's some of the discus that I have here. I think they maybe already were shown.
Yeah.
Different angels. Congo tetras. I have some rummy noses are a favorite of mine.
That's gorgeous.
Here's a cichlid that is a rainbow cichlid.
Oh, look with the eggs inside the.
Oh yeah, it's a real cool shot.
Yeah, it is a cool shot.
Oh, they had so many babies, and man, I I couldn't keep up with them. Here's actually a video of wrigglers. So the eggs hatching out. This is my angelfish babies. It's a family photo of the angels from in here.
Oh, okay.
So like 6 of them are from here, and the dad's in here. Let's see if I can play that again.
Nice.
Yeah, I had this in like a breed. It was a hang in the back refugium I had, and so I just used it for this. So, and they lay hundreds of eggs at one time. So you have to hatch out baby brine shrimp every day. And I had 2 different cultures going to make sure they had enough food all the time. Fed like 4 times a day.
Okay. Well, that kind of goes with a question we have. So Rob B and Reefs asked, out of the 15, what was your favorite? So I guess you talked about one time you had 15 aquariums. You were just showing us. What was your favorite tank that you had of those 15?
That's a good question. Because they're all different kind of almost hyperfixations. That's kind of how I am. Where, okay, this is this really cool fish. Like one of them, I had a breeding pair of black night rams. Those are one of my favorite fish. Or probably my reef tanks were the mainstay of those tanks. Most of them I did own were either holding tanks for grow out, or I have spawning pairs going. Sometimes it would go up to 20 because I'd have buckets of fish, or just like holding containers, like totes of stuff going on, or in between. Like I had probably like 7 betas just like stacked around with sponge filters going, and just airline tubing going wherever.
And your girlfriend is cool with all this?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Marry her, man.
Yep. Now it's a little more realistic. I've been limited to 4 display tanks in the future house, so that'll be
okay.
Different thing there. But I also have my fish room. I'm sure I got off limits. Like I was like, well, I'm gonna have this in the basement or whatever. I'm gonna have maybe whatever down there, and it's like, well, as long as it's not everywhere in the house.
Man cave, lock the door.
Lock the door.
That's what
I think my planet tank, honestly, that was also probably my favorite because it was the easiest. Because that was like I had a 55. I showed it a little bit earlier. That was while I was going on with my burnout, but that was the one that I could go in, sit up my chair, turn around, and just enjoy it.
Right?
Because I put all the plants in there, and I didn't have to do anything there. Everything was good. I just fed them, and they just were flourishing. Aside from when my angelfish tried to breed, then it'll get a little hairy there. But that was probably my favorite for a while.
Okay. Dexter B asks, do most people try stocking big dream fish like tangs first? So I guess, when you have like new customers, new hobbyists come in, and first thing they want to do is stock tangs. Not really a good idea. How do you handle that?
Honestly, I don't think I've always had people ask for tangs first. Because it's quarantine, they're not like an impulse buy that's easy to stomach sometimes. Like a hippo tang isn't cheap, for the ones that have, it's obviously education. Like, hey, I know you just got this like 125 gallon tank, but no, you probably should not put a powder blue tang in that. That's going to end well, especially doing it first. You're not going to be able to add a lot of tangs later on at all if you want something different. And even other fish, like tanks can be aggressive to whomever. Honestly, a lot of the people that I talk to, they just have nano tanks. They have stuff that's between, 15 and, at most 75 gallons, And the people that do have huge tanks, normally they're people who have actually been doing it for a while, or it's a tank upgrade and they've learned, or they're willing to listen. They're like, oh, this is my first like 180 gallon reef. What should I stock first? I'm like, well, you got a lot of options, but I wouldn't do a tang. Do an acclimation box or something like that later on. So I think the really good thing to do as a beginner hobbyist doing the saltwater is having a fish plan, and Evolve's really, Evolve's really good at that, or Eat Breakfast, sorry, on the fish kind of, compatibility
stocking list
thread.
Yeah.
Yep. Stocking list. I think that's a great thing to do. Like come up with a list of what you want, what's your dream fish, what you really think is cool. See if it works. Right.
Okay.
I have the best time talking to hobbyists that have done that, because I can go, okay, if you want that, you can't do this, or you got to do it in this order, try it this way.
Okay. All right. So here's another question for you. So someone asked, for those individuals that ask for advice but then consistently ignore it, do you have a way to nicely tell them you are not listening? So how do you handle, I guess, tactfully people that are just not listening to the advice you're trying to give them when you're working at the fish store?
I think it definitely depends on what kind of advice, like what are they doing wrong. If it's like fish selection, we talked about it earlier, where we educate first. Why is this a bad idea? Why I wouldn't do that, and then sometimes outright saying like, "Hey, this won't work," or like, "This fish will not be alive." Like, okay, don't do all of this at once. Don't put all this fish at once because they're all going to die. Right?
Right.
Sometimes you have to be really blunt and change your, because you can be soft and like, "Hey, like, I don't think it's going to work." And sometimes you got to go, "That's not going to work. Don't do that."
Right.
And if you could break through that person, that's usually that works. Like, I never really encountered a situation in which somebody won't listen. In that case, like most fish stores have, say, like a warranty, like, "Hey, as this fish dies, you can come, get it replaced or give store credit." Most places don't do saltwater. I don't do that. But for freshwater, for example, we do. I'll tell them like, "Hey, if you're going to do this, I'm not going to give you like a refund if it doesn't work out." That's
Okay.
also a tool to say, "Oh, I shouldn't do this." He's really saying like, no.
Right. Kind of gives them pause, like maybe I should think more carefully about, doing this.
Correct.
Right.
So that's there. Um, it's can be really hard because you can try your best to explain why something's not a good idea. Like, say it's not related to adding fish, but say it's maybe not endangering them, but maybe it's a really weird way they're doing something. Like maybe they're adding salt directly into the tank, and you try to explain like, "Hey, that's maybe not a good idea." And maybe they'll still do it regardless. You just have to accept that there's a lot of people and they're going to do what they want to do. And
Right.
you're going to try your best. Right.
Exactly. So, Jeff from Fish Hotel asked, "Do you enjoy your freshwater tanks or your saltwater tanks more?" And he also has a follow-up question, but first that.
Hmm. I enjoy them for different reasons. I think as far as tinkering and nurturing, I think that reef tanks are more enjoyable for me personally. I think I get a lot more satisfaction at being successful keeping a reef tank. For me, freshwater tanks are pretty easy, So for me, it's not that hard to be successful at it, and so for me, it's more about enjoying it. I have this living art in my home. I can sit down and just enjoy it, or I'm like, "Oh, it's an ad break on the TV. I'm just going to sit there and stare at my tank, and just enjoy it." Uh, so as far as like having problems, my freshwater tanks usually never have problems, um, and so they're just easier to enjoy versus like a reef tank. It's harder to enjoy because you look at, "Oh, that's not good," or, "Oh, the cyano's there coming back. Oh, I gotta do this, I gotta do this." So yeah.
Okay. And then he also wants to know, do you have a good resource for a proper quarantine of freshwater fish? Because on the forum we talk all about saltwater quarantine, but where would where would people go? How would they learn how to properly quarantine freshwater fish?
That's a good question. I don't really. There's a lot of it has been anecdotal. Um, there's a lot of old school methods that work very well. There's a lot of medications. It's not as serious as far as when I treat stuff. Like when I get like shipments of freshwater fish in, um, maybe I'll do like an ick or something and treat for ick there, or maybe they have internal parasites that's really easy to use. Say like General Cure, like Paracleanse and Metro covers most of your bases. Me personally, I do quarantine my freshwater fish. I run them through like ick. That's what my preference is, and then I do a treatment of like Paracleanse or General Cure, and really observation.
Okay.
Some fish, I mean, like Discus, for example, I actually have issues with them getting flukes. I've seen that pretty often. So that's a pretty easy treatment of Pro, and that usually fixes the issue. So really, observation for me is a lot more key in seeing like, "Hey, is there anything going on here?" Sometimes they're not as easy to, as say like saltwater fish. I honestly think it's easier to diagnose a saltwater fish than it is a freshwater fish sometimes. With a freshwater fish, sometimes it's like, well, you're going to kind of throw a kitchen sink at it a little bit and hope that something sticks. I would love to have, if you could make a freshwater kind of procedure, that'd be pretty good.
Challenge accepted. I've actually wanted to learn more about freshwater fish diseases and treatments. It's just time,
Mhm.
finding the time to actually start to do all the research and everything and come up with a good freshwater protocol. But I'm interested in that because I've kind of heard the same thing you're saying. It's kind of anecdotal, and there's not really seems to be like a go-to resource out there for how to quarantine freshwater fish. So I find that interesting that that doesn't exist, and yet freshwater has been around a lot longer than saltwater.
Yeah, the information I got from was actually Corey from Aquarium Co-op. They have their what's called their Med Trio. That's really when I was getting back into freshwater. That's where I went to for a lot of information, and that's
Okay.
what he did at his store that worked for him. Salt is actually a really useful treatment tool, especially if you're keeping guppies, mollies, swordtails, platies. Those guys are all like brackish fish, so you can raise them up and cure pretty much anything, and then come bring them back down. So that works not obviously for not all fish.
Okay. So that would be more like for live bearers than egg layers. The
Correct. Like
doing
tetras and stuff. Yeah. There's also an interesting disease that I don't know if there's been any recent research on it, but dwarf grommy iridovirus. Like there's some weird, different kind of diseases that are like I don't know anything about them. I just accept that I can't fix this. I'll throw Metro and Prazi, and I'll do antibiotics, and I'll do laced food, and can't fix anything.
So now I'm going
You
to be
know,
up all night reading about this.
correct.
I'm going to have to like go on Google Scholar. Okay.
You gotta.
Okay. So Dexter says, "Love the discus. What's your dream or favorite freshwater fish? Is it discus or
It's discus.
discus?"
It's always been discus for me. I have always loved them. Their colors are beautiful. Red turquoise. These are one of my favorite kinds of discus. There's a lot of different patterns that I really want to get into, like your leopards or your eruptions. Those are really cool. Um, that's probably my dream fish. I really like a lot of South American stuff. So South American cichlids, different kind of geophagus or earth eaters. My favorites are rams as well. So ram, cichlids, Ramineralizing, microgeophagus, I think that's species name. Just cool little niche fish like that. Pistogrammas are really cool. And so that's kind of the interesting thing versus like saltwater, where our dream fish tend to be very expensive or very hard to keep. Like my dream fish was copper bands, and that
Right.
was a really kind of, or like I love regal angels and I love multi-bar angels and I love all these cool fish, leopard wrasses, but they're hard. They're not easy to keep or even to get healthy at the beginning or to even quarantine.
They're hard to get eating. That to me seems like it's the whole thing with regal angels and copperman butterflies and some of these wrasses. It's like finding a food that they will eat, and then once you get, then you can get them healthy and transition them to other foods. But it's always finding that first food that they will eat. Like no two copper bands eat the same thing.
Mm-mm.
Some will eat blackworms, some want mysis. I mean, it's different. So and I'm going to preface this with saying this. Okay, first I want to. So you are one of our fish disease experts on the forum, and I want to thank you for volunteering your time to be a fish disease expert on the forum. And again, if anybody wants to interact with Vince, you just come on the forum, and he's one of the fish disease experts. Or if you want to talk to him about freshwater fish, we do have a freshwater subforum as well. But Jeff says, how upset are you that you said yes to becoming a Humblefish fish disease expert? Of course, I am kidding. We're so thankful to have you on the team, Vince. So Jeff feels like we roped you into that, I guess.
I never thought I'd be here. When I came to the forum, I remember what I asked, and I felt so dumb asking it. Like if I would read what I wrote now, I'm like, oh goodness, it's just all about learning for me. Like I think I really wanted to do well by my fish. I cared a lot about them. I care about the longevity of them. I wanted to see them do better. And for me, learning as much as I could is that kind of stopgap to that. If I could learn everything, maybe I could keep everything, kind of thing. So for me, it's about the fish. So I did the fish medic thing for a while, and you guys chose me, and I was very grateful for that. I've learned everything I could from you guys, so it's good.
Yeah, and we're so thankful to have you, and I think you give great advice, and I think you saved a lot of fish lives and helped a lot of people with their fish disease problems. So we thank you for that. That's awesome of you. Um, So we have another question here. It looks like probably the last question we'll have for you. I acclimated several mollies to saltwater a few months ago. Will they be highly susceptible to catch marine parasites since they have no natural immunity from past exposure? I'll let you answer that.
So would they be highly?
Well, I guess he took some mollies. He added them. So he acclimated freshwater mollies to saltwater. And then he's asking, will they be highly susceptible to catch marine parasites since they have no natural immunity from past exposure? So they've never been exposed to marine pathogens.
So that's the key, is if they've never been exposed to marine
Right.
pathogens.
Yes.
Something interesting that I don't think most people actually know is mollies, like from the store, sometimes come from farms in Florida that are kept in brackish situations, and there could be cross-contamination at that point. Really, if we want to be nitty-gritty, you want to breed those mollies that you get from the store, and those babies have no sensitivity whatsoever. But how often that's really going to be part of that, I doubt it.
Right. It's not a perfect solution. It's a canary in a coal mine situation. Yeah. And to me, it's like, well, it's one more fish, especially for quarantine. It's one more fish to just keep an eye on, to look for white dots, especially because they're black colored fish, to look for white dots, to look for evidence of mostly ick and velvet. I know some people that use them in like their observation tank, or some people even like to put them in their sump of their DT, and the mollies will sometimes hit before any other fish, and it kind of is like an early alarm that you may have a problem. And I don't want to sound heartless, but people that are a little gun shy about doing a skin scrape on a $100-$200 saltwater fish, well, the molly, you can do a skin scrape on that, and it's it's a fish that's a few dollars, right?
I love like black molly quarantine. I use that a lot actually at home. If you got time to observe them, it's pretty good. I have them in little acclimation boxes, and you can just kind of walk by and see, if anything hits or whatnot. I recently actually had to go through like a follow period in one of my tanks. I got velvet in there, and black mollies are what I use to test. It's pretty good. I could get an aquabiomics test, but I could also buy a $2 molly and do the same.
Right. So the mollies hit first when you had the velvet infestation?
No, so I used them to check if it had got eradicated at the end.
Okay, gotcha. Like for observation. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, I think that's good. I think support your local fish stores. I mean, obviously go in there with the filter, I would say, where you should be able to distinguish if this person is just trying to sell you stuff, or if they're trying to be genuine. Not all fish stores are bad. Some of them can be bad, and they push products or something like that. So you can kind of tell from there. Talk to them. Sometimes I have like advanced hobbyists that they're like, oh, I'm not going to talk to you. I know more than you. And I'm like, come on, man, loosen up a little bit. Once they hear, they're like, oh, you have a like Discus tank and you've got a Reef tank. Oh, you probably know some stuff.
Right.
Then they're like, okay, I'll listen to you. All right.
Yeah, it gets people a little uppity sometimes.
Here's another thing. Buy some merch.
Yes.
Support the forum that way.
Yep. So the forum is humble.fish, just address bar, just humble.fish. And it's a all-inclusive, reefing community. We talk about anything and everything. Also, if you have any fish disease questions, you can go on the forum, and either myself or someone like Vince will answer your question. And it's a good way to interact with us. So I want to thank you, Vince, for being on the show. This has been great. I think you've mostly, disseminated a lot of good, useful information here. I really like it, especially that, this is, people have been exposed to freshwater fish now. And, maybe some people are the wheels are turning. Maybe I want to set up a freshwater tank,
Start a thread.
Yeah. Awesome.
Okay.
Mention
me in it.
Okay, so the next live stream is going to be next Tuesday, August the 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 5 p.m. Pacific. And I will be interviewing the owner of Refi Lab Smart Aquarium Solutions. And I think a lot of people know there's some lights that they're making that a lot of people are talking about and a lot of people are interested in. So I will be interviewing the owner of Refi Lab to talk about their products and lights. So want to thank everybody for watching. Want to thank you, Vince, for being my guest, and we'll see you next week. Take care.